Well, good afternoon to both Scott Baker and Tom Fox. Glad to have you both with us.
Indeed. Good to see you, Mikey. It is Tuesday, 13th of January, 3 p.m. Eastern Time for those who are watching live, and hi to everybody that's listening later on Lead Better. Today's field note, number 1679, entitled Confronting Conspiracy Theories in the Workplace. And those could be conspiracy theories like, they're really monitoring our email or our Slack messages. And I just want to tell you guys that they're listening right now. There are people listening live to what we're saying right now.
It's hard to convince people that that's something that is just a conspiracy and not true because of how many ads I get popped up after just I wonder how many ads are going to come up as a result of this conversation that pop up on my phone within the next 30 minutes, right? We'll have to think of it. And so trying to convince people that things aren't a conspiracy is up. And I think that's why it kind of showed up in our comment section a little bit. People are like, are you trying to say there's no conspiracies out there? There's real conspiracies out there.
Well, that's why we brought Tom on today, because you're near Washington, D.C., right?
I am, yes.
Yeah, there's a poster right above your head that says Washington. As in the movie Mr. Smith Going to Washington. So we thought, this is the guy that has helped, sort of help conspiracies to spread throughout Washington. We'll bring him on. No, it's not what Tom does. So, but I do have a question about that, which is, because I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, do you get a little bit baked in this sort of, I don't know, a cynicism about the way that this stuff gets through organizations, or how people just start to think, well, that's what's happening. That's what the man's doing.
Yeah. I think cynicism is a real threat, both to those who buy into the conspiracy theories, as well as leaders who are trying to deal with it. In that, sure, you have the people who buy into, the company's listening to me or reading my email. But then you have leaders who will say, well, they're just going to believe what they're going to believe. I'm just going to let it be. Or, I'm just going to write those folks off. And that's just as counterproductive as the conspiracy theory is to really building and cultivating a high performing team. And so I love this field note for what it encourages leaders to do in opposition to those conspiracy theories.
Yeah. Well, and let me tee up part of this, Mikey, because you were listening to a conversation that I just had for our actual Playbook subscribers to our main platform. We do a live once every 3 weeks conversation with Randall and some of our partners. And Randall, who writes most of the field notes, they often come out of real examples. And so I said, is there a scenario here that you were dealing with? And please name names exactly. No, he didn't go into the names, but he said it did. And he said, actually, this doesn't come up that often, which is what is really interesting to me about this. And he said, but it was an organization where, as the field note's talking about, there's change, there's things going on. And suddenly in the organization, there's this sort of feeling that well, something's happening, or they're doing this, the big they. And the leaders really had to deal with it. And one of the interesting things was, and you hinted at it here, Tom, was they were like, well, no, this isn't happening. And they had, I don't know if they had a slide deck, but they were like, well, here's how we do this, and here's how we do this. And everybody was like, they are over responding. It must be true. So the response actually made it worse by not just kind of dealing with it and letting it die down. So when the organizations and the leaders that you coach, Tom, would you reflect that it is kind of the not every day, but the occasional thing, and therefore maybe leaders aren't prepared to really know what to do when it happens?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point. I don't think it happens all the time, but you'll see it perk up on certain circumstances, right? So, for example, during the annual performance cycle, when, people are receiving their reviews and their year-end bonuses and those sorts of things, conspiracy theories tend to sort of run amok. If or when there's an organization or a reorganization within a company, that's when the rumor mill tends to, run roughshod over reality. So yeah, I agree that it doesn't happen all that often, except in particular circumstances. So as a result, leaders are often unprepared. I also think that the natural response for most people, as was outlined in the field note, is to confront fiction with fact, right? Well,
Mhm.
if people are just misunderstanding things, all I have to do is tell them exactly what's happening, and that should clear things up. And, as you said, it can seem as though the leader's coming across as defensive, right? That they're over responding to the circumstances. I can think of a
Mhm.
leader I just recently worked with who was going through the year-end compensation decisions and had a really high
Mhm.
performer who was quite bought into a conspiracy theory that he was just being held down, that he wasn't getting his
Mm.
rewards because ... right? He had all these
Mhm.
reasons. And so, we actually walked through a process quite like this to help him sort of peel back the layers of what his assumptions and thoughts were going into that conversation with that employee, so he could help him level set and ground, his opinion in reality. And truth be told, he was still unhappy, right? He still wanted a
Mm.
higher sort of pay increase and bonus, but he understood why he wasn't getting it. It wasn't that anyone was trying to hold him back or hold
Right.
him down. It was a set of organizational factors that were beyond his managers and even his managers' decision making.
I'm interested, Tom. We mentioned 3 questions here in the field note, in particular, asking people, how did you come to this belief? What is your
Mhm.
confidence level from like 0 to 100
Mhm.
that this belief is accurate? And what the evidence would change your mind, right? And so there's
Mhm.
an approach in those questions that sounds, maybe it's like what you did. What are the actual questions that you had your circumstance go through with this person that you're referencing?
Yeah, so I think these are an excellent starting point, and then you can sort of tailor them to the particular circumstances, right? So let's,
Mhm.
Mhm.
for example, take that first question. How did you come to this belief? In this instance, prepping the leader for the conversation with the employee, the starting point was, tell me what you understand about our compensation decisions, right? So like walk me through what you understand the process to be, right? And then asking, right? You know, how did you come to that conclusion? Who shared this approach with you, right? So that you can get a sense of that 0 to 100% certainty. And then you ask them, well, what would help to clarify how we make our compensation decisions? Would you like me to tell you how I make my conclusions, and how those then sort of go up the chain of command within the organization? And the employee was very interested, right?
Good.
And again, he came to an understanding, not necessarily satisfaction with the
Right.
outcome or the output, but a comfort with the process that he didn't have before then.
Right. Now, it's interesting to me how often we create communication voids, and sometimes we create them on
Mhm.
purpose. Sometimes it's because there is a level of confidentiality that we need to maintain
Mhm.
before a public announcement is made, if it's a public. But otherwise, it's just a standard thing that we don't talk about compensation with other people,
Mhm.
and then we try to push that down in a value through our organization, saying we don't do that. But that inherently will cause these communication voids that will breed conspiracy. So specifically on this compensation one, like I had a conversation with a Division 1 volleyball coach here recently who is trying to keep the amount of NIL money rev share
Mhm.
confidential from like the members of his team. Like, so there's 15 players on the team and they should not be talking amongst themselves. But it's teenage girls in a
Yeah,
locker
right.
room, and you're asking them not to share
Yeah, shouldn't
that
shouldn't be a problem.
information. Well, it definitely is. But the whole idea that he's asking them not to talk about it creates this void. So what is the kind of recommendation you make to someone when it seems to be inherent in the system to sometimes have these communication lapses?
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think again, thinking of the conditions in which this sort of thing most consistently creeps into sort of an organization or a team, it's during those times where the conversation is uncomfortable. Generally speaking, people don't like to talk about compensation, right? So then they'll kind of brush it to the side until they have to talk about it, which is
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
worst point. It's too late at that point, right? People have already come to their conclusions. I think of this a lot with reorganizations as well. Most organizations don't want to talk about it until it's time to unveil the perfect plan that turns out to be anything
Mhm. Right,
perfect.
right.
I think a couple of things. One, you can definitely go back after the fact. If you've, sort of made a misstep or there's been a gap in communication, you can use this opportunity to channel your curiosity as a leader to understand sort of a person's reasoning. But I've also seen organizations sort of cut off the conspiracies at the pass, right? I can think of
Mhm.
one large construction and engineering firm that I worked with, and is befitting engineers, right? They were going through a reorganization, and they talked with their entire workforce. First, it's a conversation around what circumstances are changing, for the
Mhm.
organization, for the economy, for the country. Okay, here's what we're facing. Next step is, here are the things that we're going to have to address in order to sustain ourselves as a company. Third step, here's some of the things that we're thinking about. What is it we're missing? What else is it we should be thinking about or should be considering that we haven't taken into account? So they went through this. It seemed like a laborious process, but the reality is they were going to have all those conversations anyhow. By including people throughout the organization in those conversations, it cut down the conspiracies, right? There'd still be people who
Mhm.
creep
Mhm.
up with, this thought or that thought, but they could then have that conversation and encourage them to talk to colleagues who had been a part of that discussion. And so it wasn't just a sort of a top-down message, but it was really something that permeated across the organization. So there are going to be times where you can't have those conversations, like compensation and NIL. That's a tough one for sure. But if you can talk about the process, talk about how you go about your decision-making process, say over the course of weeks or months or
Mhm.
throughout a year, it cuts down on this building conspiracy theory that occurs when you finally do have the conversation.
Well, and Mikey, you hinted at the thing not talked about, and sometimes in admired leadership, we talk about the fact that if you happen to see the chief executive officer, the chief financial officer in the corner glass office, and they're there for Friday, Saturday, all day Sunday, and they're staring at papers, nobody in the organization is going, "I bet it's good news.
Yeah,
I
right.
bet we're all getting raises, right?"
Yeah.
If you're not saying anything and communicating, people are going to kind of come around this conspiracy of like, oh gosh. And then once they actually have a narrative built into their minds, it's hard to start to deconstruct that narrative. So it's always advisable to organizations to be communicating to the extent that they can, as clearly as they can. But one of the interesting things to me was in this idea of dealing with conspiracy. The other day, we had a field note about leaders anticipating resistance. Like, where do you think the resistance to your message is going to be? Well, you can, in this same drill, think, well, where is the conspiracy going to come if I'm silent? And so
Mhm.
you can just feel how that would develop. And I think that's the balance that probably an advisor like Tom can kind of come in and say, well, this is like with the engineering firm. Let's talk about it this way. Let's get everybody in here, because that's what you're doing in the advice in the field note. You're saying, let me, in a dialogue, how did you come to that belief? What's your confidence level? What would be some things that could help, in terms of, what would it look like if you had a different view? Those kind of things can lead to real change, but that takes a pretty sophisticated, nuanced leader, it sounds like.
Yeah, and I would add, I'm so glad you said that, Scott, because I think, a leader can understand this intellectually. The hard part is not knowing it's doing, right? And in particular, if I'm coaching a leader or a team of leaders in an organization through a challenge like this, oftentimes it's these questions, but it's
Mm-hmm.
also paired with a set of questions around, and how are you going to maintain your patience in the face of folks who are countering everything that you have to say? How are you going to make sure you
Mm-hmm.
do your very best so that you can maintain your equanimity in the face of what can sometimes be a really difficult conversation? I think that is important to include in this discussion.
Now, a
Yeah.
hard part would be for me is that if the conspiracy theory that you're imagining actually calls my values and judgment into question, I'm going to want to be fact based. Like, I want to clear the air here. But the advice here is not to do that, right? The advice is to, like, say, in the face of deeply outrageous beliefs that a person might have, I'm going to continue to be respectful in a non confrontational way. So, whereas I might feel my knee jerk reaction is to be like, if you don't trust me, then I'm
Mm-hmm.
out of here, right? But
Mhm.
you can't do that, right? And so allowing that to be the trust factor, to be the background of the issue, and let's just instead focus on the way that these questions kind of roll out, and
Mm-hmm.
we're allowing you to see how your decision making process might be have some gaps in it, right? We'll just deal with it that way instead of me defending myself. That's going to be hard for some leaders, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it is the difference between an average and an admired leader, not to play off of, our name, but that really is the difference. It is hard. And so thinking about what you can do, what tools and techniques will keep you in a steady state will be instrumental to this approach succeeding.
Great.
Well, I think the obvious last question, the famous Peter Thiel question about, what's something that you believe that other people think is crazy? Well, what's a conspiracy that you actually believe, Mikey?
Well, I don't know if it's a conspiracy as much as it's a data point, but the Pentagon pizza alerts.
Right. Okay, that's a good
I
one.
think
Yeah.
I think they're a real thing. Now there's all kinds of ways we can go through these 3 questions and be like, what's my confidence level
Right.
in them?
Uh-huh.
Like, I'm not trading stocks on them, but I actually believe that the Pentagon pizza thing is a real
Well,
thing.
I saw somebody on X today say, I just ordered 600 pizzas, to go to the Pentagon to throw off the poly markets.
Yeah, right.
So yeah, that could work. I don't know, Tom, you have any big, conspiracies that you're like, I think that might be true?
So my first reaction is to say, of course not. Like I'm above and beyond conspiracies, but I will say that if my favorite team loses a sporting event, I'm inclined to think that somehow the referees were aligned again.
Right. The NFL being rigged is a huge one these days.
Yeah.
There's lots of people talking about that.
Well, that was absolutely not the case for why the Steelers lost last night.
Yes.
So, but I will say Santa Claus is obviously real. So I'm sticking with that.
All right. Good to talk to you both. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Bye now.